Hi everyone, welcome to another video. It's been a long time and I finally watched all the security talks of KubeCon, and this video I'm going to be talking about KubeCon North America that just happened recently, my observations around the security track and what I learned from the security track at KubeCon. Let's get started. Hi everyone, my name is Abhay and I'm the CEO of a global application security company called V45. But this is my personal channel, and in this channel, I talk about everything from tech to the cloud to Kubernetes, and of course, I talk about my favorite subject, security. If you like this sort of content, you should definitely like, share, and subscribe this channel, and stay tuned for a lot of updates coming in the future as well. While I've been teaching Kubernetes security for a while now, this was my first ever KubeCon that I actually attended. Now, usually I attend conferences as a speaker, but in this case, I thought I will just attend as a delegate because I've been seeing a lot of new things happen around the Kubernetes ecosystem that suddenly mushroomed. There's eBPF, there is, of course, stuff around policy management, there's stuff around privacy, there is stuff around threat detection. So I really wanted to check this out as a delegate this time around. So, which is why I actually decided to go for this year's KubeCon North America. It was a pretty interesting experience, but let's start off with the negatives, then talk about the positives, right? First of all, the content site, while the content was great across KubeCon entirely, the content site was not great at all. In fact, I had a really confusing experience with the way the online layout was designed, the way you would get to different talks and the tracks, and it was a little confusing, and every time I seemed to go down some rabbit hole that led to nowhere. So I was not very comfortable with the virtual experience. I truly hope that conferences are in person next year, and I'm really waiting for in-person conferences where I can actually go and sit in talks, talk to people in the event. That's going to be mind-blowing after 2020 and the debacle of 2020. But having said that, I really found the content compelling. I thought it was, they did, definitely the CNCF has tried to do a very good job in putting this together, but the online thing for me just didn't work as well from an experience perspective. And even though I was really interested in looking at it, I felt a little confused most of the time trying to get through the online content. However, having said that, I really liked the content. The content was awesome. The content was really relevant to me, especially on the work I was doing with a lot of my clients as well as for my trainings. I thought the content was great. I thought the content was very practical in the sense that they had clearly picked good talks that were that were done by practitioners, people who had actually worked on solving a lot of these problems in Kubernetes at scale in many cases. So I really liked that part of it. So my interest was, of course, was the security and privacy track, and I really focused on that. Although I did check out from other tracks. There were a lot of other tracks that were happening, but I really focused in on the security and privacy track and some other tracks that were kind of related to it, like logging and SRE and that kind of stuff. So if you're not registered for KubeCon, you might have to wait for these videos to be released on YouTube. But if you have access to KubeCon, these are some of the talks that I'm going to be summarizing and checking. You can check it out either when it comes on YouTube or if you already have an access to the KubeCon virtual experience. Now, I've watched most of the security track videos. I'm going to be summarizing that in this video. I'm not going to go beyond that. I'm not going to talk about other tracks. I'm going to focus in on the security track and what I learned from the security track. So let's do some overarching thoughts first, and then let's dive into some of the talks and what they actually did and what I learned from these talks. So first of all, from a security perspective, the track was small. There were a few talks, but they were really good talks. I really appreciate that. A lot of times you go into conferences and the title sounds good, but when you actually sit in the talk is totally crap. But in KubeCon, thankfully, we had good talks for the most part. Most of the speakers really knew what they were doing, so I really appreciate that about the conference and the security track per se. One of the things I definitely have to say with the security track this year versus the talks that I've seen in the previous years on YouTube and so on is that we've kind of gone through a bit of an evolution in Kubernetes, right? So people now have gotten to a point where Kubernetes is pretty normal. People understand Kubernetes, but they don't, and they even understand some of the basics of Kubernetes security. So this year it kind of reflected that because all the practitioners were talking about things like policy management, things like scaling, threat detection, things like running authorization sidecars and stuff like that, and talking about additional Kubernetes vulnerability assessment tools and so on. So the impetus was largely more on the more advanced and more evolved security concepts, or slightly beyond things like RBAC and audit logging and stuff like that, to more, I would say, more intermediate to advanced topics. So I really like that about this year as well, because I think for me especially that made more sense. I'm sure if you're new to Kubernetes altogether, the security track this year might be a little difficult to follow, but I think over time, once you start getting into the ecosystem, into the community, looking at the previous talks, you'll make a lot more sense of these talks as well. So I really appreciate that about this year's KubeCon security track. Here are the talks that stood out for me in particular. The first talk that stood out for me, and I was mind blown by this talk, was PKI The Wrong Way by Tabitha Sable. Now, this talk was amazing simply because they essentially looked at Kubernetes exploits. So it was pretty much a red team talk as far as I was concerned, although they did get into some of these security aspects as well. But they really focused in on blue team. They really focused in on red team, and they focused in on how you can compromise Kubernetes clusters with just the PKI implementation. So they looked at cluster CA and how you can leverage cluster CA to perform a whole bunch of different types of attacks. So just the PKI infrastructure in Kubernetes and how you can leverage that to perform all kinds of authorization bypasses, in many cases, full cluster takeovers, things like that. It was really an amazing talk. Things that stood out for me was how they were able to leverage a misconfigured HashiCorp Vault PKI infrastructure that was running on HashiCorp Vault. And HashiCorp Vault is a great product. I love HashiCorp Vault. But remember, you can misconfigure anything, and you can misconfigure Vault just the same. So one of the things that I saw was how you can leverage a misconfigured HashiCorp Vault to kind of take over the cluster, talk to HCD, do a lot of these different things. That was a phenomenal attack. I highly recommend you look at it if you have the chance to do right now, or wait till you have these talks on YouTube. That was one of the highlights of the talk for me. The other attacks were also extremely good. Things like the RequestAuth Proxy Rowdiness that they spoke about, and the chain attacks that we spoke about as well. So I really enjoyed watching how public key infrastructure could be leveraged in Kubernetes if you set it up naively, or you misconfigure stuff, or you don't look at defense in depth. This was an eye-opening talk, and I'm definitely going to be digging into this in days to come, probably doing a lot more lab and research work around this area personally as well. So I really like this talk. I highly recommend you check it out. If you are even a extremely advanced Kubernetes administrator, definitely check this out. There are a lot of good value-added points to be learned from this talk. This was awesome. Hats off to Tabitha Sable for this particular talk. The other talk that stood out for me was using OPA to meet evolving policy requirements. Now, OPA, the Open Policy Agent, is a project that I've worked on in research capacity, as well as, of course, been implementing a lot of different rules for authorization for APIs as well as Kubernetes. I've done a lot of work in multiple places using OPA. So OPA has been a pet project of mine. It's really a fun project that I love to work on. I look at OPA and I can think of limitless possibilities that Open Policy Agent can bring in, especially in the authorization, policy management, policy decision-making workspace, right? So that's something that I find OPA to be extremely useful, extremely powerful for. Now, the reason I like this talk was that this talk was an implementer's perspective of Open Policy Agent, and not just this 30,000 feet in the air talk on Open Policy Agent. So this was by a team within VMware that was running a multi-tenant cluster. So obviously they were running a large multi-tenant cluster, and they were not having their problem solved with RBAC, so they decided to go with OPA, and they decided to go with kube management so that they could do mutating webhooks and things like that with OPA. So I found that their use case was very real, especially if you're a large enterprise implementing Kubernetes, which is happening quite a bit, right? A lot of large enterprises are implementing Kubernetes. They're implementing policy as code, especially because today You have seen the deprecating of pod security policy. You're seeing a lot of the Kubernetes admission controls being deprecated in favor of using things like OPA. OPA has become extremely popular, extremely important, and extremely relevant going forward as well. So I think one of the things I definitely took from this talk was how they were able to leverage OPA to be able to do a bunch of validating and mutating use cases, right? How they were able to do policy management for large clusters, have policies deployed selectively across different namespaces. That was really useful. How they were even able to do things like compliance, PCI compliance, FedRAMP compliance, things like that for dedicated clusters with OPA. It was really useful stuff. And the fact that they were able to scale it was definitely a testament to the fact that OPA is extremely scalable. I've seen this myself, and I really enjoyed looking at this talk. I took away a bunch of notes. Of course, my notes are in my blog here, so definitely check it out and understand what I took from this talk. And I definitely recommend you watch this talk, especially when it's out on YouTube or if you have access to it right now. The other talk that I really enjoyed was the security kill chain in a 100,000 container environment talk by folks at MathWorks. So there were two speakers from MathWorks who spoke about deploying sysdig Falco for threat detection and identifying security issues within their Kubernetes cluster with Falco. Now, Falco is a well-known threat detection, and of course, their enterprise version does a lot more than just threat detection. I think they do a lot of threat prevention and other additional rules and things like that. So, I mean, even without the enterprise stuff, Falco is still available as an open source product. It still has a lot of teeth as an open source product from a detection standpoint, right? So I like the talk simply because it was a nice introduction to Falco. Although I've used Falco a bunch of times at client projects as well as in my training and part of my labs. I always like to see how people are using Falco, and clearly they've been using Falco in quite extensive ways. So it's nice that they have included Falco in not only their core threat detection workflow, but for alerts in Slack and dashboards and things like that. So I really like the way they've ingested it. The other thing that I really liked about this talk was the way they've ingested data from Falco into a machine learning algorithm and then looked at anomalies, right? Because one of the things with alerts, especially from threat detection or any kind of detection tools, is the noise, right? So one of the things I saw was the anomaly thing that they've done, especially being a math company. I'm sure they're pretty good at machine learning. So they've been able to load it into their ML workflows and been able to find these needle in haystack kind of conditions with Falco. So I really like the way they took us through that experience. So it's definitely a worthwhile talk to check out. Definitely check it out when you have the time. The last talk that stood out in my mind in the security track is the SecOmp, What It Can Do For You talk by Justin Cormack. Now, I've been following Justin Cormack for a while because of his work with the Notary project and the Tough framework. He's done some amazing stuff. He's also one of the people, along with Jesse Frazell, who brought the SecOmp implementation to Docker in 2016. So I really wanted to hear his thoughts on SecOmp, especially because SecOmp is something that I've always found to be great, but something that's always a little difficult to implement. And apparently it turned out to be true. It was a very introspective talk where he spoke about the fact that, yeah, SecOmp is good. It has a certain set of use cases. It has a certain set of valid use cases, but it does have a lot of adverse impacts. And he did speak about multiple scenarios where SecOmp broke things and SecOmp did actually no protection at all in some cases. So it was definitely a talk that led me to believe, again, I don't have that kind of a worldview into SecOmp per se, but from what I could gather from his talk, it seemed that SecOmp was not, people should not be investing as much time and effort in SecOmp, maybe focus on something higher end of the stack or maybe something around eBPF and something like that. So that was something that I left with. Again, it really depends upon the kind of exposure you have, I guess, to syscall profiling and so on. But from what I got from his talk is that, yes, it's okay to do SecOmp, but the problem is that we're not going to see too much continuing investment in this space, especially at lower ends of the stack. So it's probably better to do detection, probably more Lambda-like approach, smaller block lists. He spoke about a bunch of things. I definitely encourage you to check out the talk. It's not an easy talk to digest from that perspective, because it does get into some deep water, but I think it's worthwhile checking out because he's a great mind, and it's something that I really enjoyed watching his work elsewhere, and I also enjoyed this talk on SecOmp, which I think makes a lot of sense for us, especially when we're implementing security for runtime protection in a containerized workflow, and that makes a lot of sense. Now it's time for some parting thoughts. Now, what did I think of this year's KubeCon, and of course this specific security track that I'm going to be focusing in on? What I do think is that Kubernetes security is definitely evolving. I think it's evolved beyond the basic stuff that we used to see a couple of years ago. I think we've moved on to a different plane. One of the things that I definitely see a lot of is Open Policy Agent. And I really hope that Open Policy Agent can be a much more encompassing solution. Because right now, some of the projects of Open Policy Agent, like Gatekeeper, don't really have mutating webhooks. I think they're in the works, but they've still not done it. But I see that Open Policy Agent is going to be a big thing moving forward. So definitely, if you are looking at doing Kubernetes security in any way, learn Open Policy Agent. It's going to make a lot of sense, especially with part security policy being deprecated. Open Policy Agent is going to have to take up that mantle somewhere down the line. So I definitely recommend looking at Open Policy Agent in a very, very serious way. Because you can do Open Policy Agent, remember, at the cluster level, you can do it at the API level. Although the API level is not as popular, but the cluster level is definitely popular. Definitely look at doing, learning and understanding Open Policy Agent and looking to implement it. I think it makes a lot of sense across the board, not only for Kubernetes, but even otherwise. The other thing that I took from this is that there are a lot of attack vectors that we still don't really look at. Kubernetes is such a complex ecosystem. There are CRDs, there's PKI, especially this itself, just the single red team talk that I saw in the form of the PKI, the PKI presentation, that itself was mind-boggling because the possibilities are so huge. They're such nuanced attacks. So if you are a Kubernetes administrator, there are definitely a lot of different things that you have to take care of. But the good thing is that if you implement a good deal of defense in depth with a certain set of standard concepts and principles and a certain set of standard resources and deployment objects that you have, you are going to be reasonably well protected against a lot of these, right? But the real challenge, I think, is going to come in if you are a pen tester. Because if you are a pen tester, things are going to change quite a bit. Kubernetes is such a complex ecosystem. I don't see you being able to do Kubernetes pen testing without being really, really familiar with Kubernetes in itself. So definitely look at these talks. Definitely look at how you can create a dictionary of attacks if you want, and then look at your Kubernetes cluster against that dictionary and of course against your threat model. That's something that I always recommend to everybody do a good job of threat modeling. So this is something that I feel that I took from this year. Kubernetes security is definitely evolving, and I think slightly more intermediate to advanced territory is going to be reached over the course of the next couple of years. We're going to see, I think, a lot more policy stuff. We're going to see a lot more threat detection stuff. And I think we're going to see a lot more integration of Kubernetes with everything else, making it a much larger, much more vibrant ecosystem moving forward rather than just what it is now, which is also quite big. But of course, I think it's only going to get bigger over the course of the next year or a couple of years. If you like that video and want to see more like this, definitely smash that like button and consider subscribing to this channel. I'll be back with more content. Till then, stay tuned. Thank you very much for watching.